All right. We've got just a couple of seconds to go, about 15 seconds to go. Then I shall invite Mr. Michael Richards for our fourth, I believe, session of the day, which is the ISO20022 session. Mr. Michael Richards, are you ready to go?
I think I am.
All right, take it away.
I will share my screen. Okay. So thank you very much for that. I want to say, first of all, before I start, that the presentations so far today have been really fantastic, I think. I've been really impressed with all of them. So things may be about to take a bit of a dive. But anyway, we'll see where we get to. So this session is really to talk about where we are with our application for Moduloop to make modifications to the existing ISO20022 standard to accommodate the way in which we want to do business. In fact, we think it's necessary to do business. It seems quite a short time since I was standing in front of you in Arusha, talking about where we got to. And in some ways, it seems as if not a great deal has happened. However, there are a number of things that have happened. So I will be talking about them, and I will then be throwing the session open for questions and I hope discussion. So starting again from our objective, that was really to extend the existing ISO20022 standard for financial messages to meet the requirements of what we are calling interoperable real-time payment systems, such as Moduloop, in emerging economies. But I want to emphasize that this is not intended to be restricted to Moduloop. We see Moduloop as the standard bearer, dare I say, and certainly the representative of a number of requirements which are common across quite a large number of payment systems in emerging economies where the participants, both the institutional participants and the customers, don't have the kind of facilities that people in developed economies are used to having. And therefore, the way in which payments are organized, particularly in order to keep the costs of payments down as far as possible to be able to support our objective, which we habitually speak of as being able to support payments of $1 per payment or less, we really find it difficult with the existing ISO20022 messages to really support that. So that's our objective. Now, if I look at where we've got so far, first of all, we made a decision that we should ensure that the existing definitions expand to accommodate the special requirements of the IRTP systems in emerging economies. And that, I think, really means that we didn't want to say this is a different kind of way of making payments. We want to say it's a related way. And in particular, we want to, as far as possible, leave the door open for institutions which support ISO20022 in more advanced economies to be able to use the messages that they're used to in order to make payments to recipients in emerging economies using the extensions that we propose. So we don't want a completely separate way of doing things. We want a way of doing things that's related, but which meets the requirements that we have. So second, we started modeling what those requirements we thought would look like using the existing Moduloop API definitions. Third, we produced an initial business justification for our requirements. Now, business justification in the ISO20022 world essentially says there is a requirement somewhere to do something like this. And essentially, it's a way of documenting the sorts of business requirements that you have. So it doesn't necessarily say anything at all yet about how you would propose to meet those requirements, whether you think that they can be met through the existing messages, whether you think new messages are required or changes to the existing messages. Generally speaking, the business justification just says there is a requirement. We then had a number of objections raised by members of the Payments Standards Evaluation Group, which we belong to, and the Resource Management Group, Registration Management Group, I should say, which is the central committee of the ISO20022 organisation, which essentially makes the final decision about what the standards should be. So we've discussed those. And we had produced an amended business justification, which at the time of the last convening was out for comment. So what happens is we produce and submit a business justification. There are then 6 weeks for interested parties in the Payments Standards Evaluation Group to comment on, and if they want to object. And then the objections, we respond to them and we take it from there. So we then had further objections raised by members of the Payments Standards Evaluation Group. And we have now got to a stage where we've agreed on the requirements for further amendments to the business justification. So it kind of looks as if we haven't really got very much further, but I hope in the rest of this presentation to at least give you some cause for optimism. So let's look at the objections. The core objection is we don't need any new messages, we can use the existing ones. Now, this was one that was made a number of times by several people. And the way in which we read this was the existing messages should be adequate for whatever you want to do. And we also thought that was because they thought that they had fully defined the nature of a payment. So I think that may have been the impression that I gave you when I talked to you about this at the last convening. So this was, I have to say, an oversimplification on my part. I have now come to realize. What I think they meant was something like the following. A payment, for instance, payments are not the only things we're talking about, but they're the main thing we're talking about. A payment is a payment. If we need to do new things as part of a payment, which we are saying we do, and if we can show that there's a business reason for wanting to do them, then that's fine. But it doesn't stop a payment being a payment. All it says is the definition of a payment needs to expand. So one consequence of that is that as far as they are concerned, there's no argument from economy. And what I mean by an argument from economy is one that says, well, the way in which we manage a payment is so different from the way in which you manage a payment that we might as well have our own message for doing it, because it's going to be simpler for everybody. They, for better or worse, do not think like that. Their view, as I say, is that a payment is a payment, and though there might be different ways of making a payment and different components of a payment, nevertheless, it's a payment. And the message that support, or the messages that support a payment, should be able to expand to accommodate the various sorts of things that might be required. Now, they're open to persuasion, I think, about the need for new functional qualities. And in fact, when we started to talk in more detail as a consequence of our last business justification about what it is that we wanted and why we wanted it, then we found them, I should say, perhaps somewhat more receptive than we had maybe expected them to be. The question, though, that they want to ask is, at what level are our needs different from what the current standard provides? Are we saying that there are differences in structure between the way in which we organize a payment and the way in which a payment is currently organized in the ISO standard? Are we saying that the structure is basically the same, but there are some changes to, let's say, the low-level definition of fields? An example of that would be, as you might know, the identifier fields in ISO messages at the moment are not long enough to accommodate UUIDs. Universal identifiers, which are the standard way throughout the module loop system for identifying anything, because they allow us to be confident that that any identifier will be universally unique, and there is no prospect of having a multiple identifier, except if you mean to identify the same thing. Now, that's an important thing for us, but it's a thing that happens quite a long way down the stack. And you can certainly imagine a case where they would say, well, we understand you need to do things like that, but all that means is either slightly to alter an existing data definition, or perhaps to introduce a choice in an identifier. So that's what I mean by saying, at what level are our needs different from what the current standard provides? So I think where we have so far, I'm going to introduce the concept here of insufficient success, which maintains a degree of optimism while allowing us to still to acknowledge the hopelessness of the whole. Oh, sorry, no, I didn't mean to say that. Where we have insufficiently succeeded so far is in showing clearly enough exactly where our requirements, we think, diverge from the existing model. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about the elements of the existing ISO data model. So when I ask what sorts of things are we trying to change, there are really four things. The first of them is the data dictionary itself. This is the underlying thing which contains definitions of all of the sorts of things that are covered by the ISO 20022 specification. Second, there's a business model which represents how a business process, and the example here is making a payment, I'll be coming back to that in a little bit, how that is made up of individual components. Third, there are the definitions of messages. Now, a check is an example of a message, of course, but there are ISO 20022 messages, and those are based on elements in the data dictionary and the business model. So a message is something which is generated out of the underlying model. It's not, as it were, a thing in its own right. And finally, there is the question of API definitions, which are also based on the underlying models, but which, of course, are not the same thing. So I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail about each of these things. So first of all, the data dictionary. The items in the data dictionary are divided into business concepts, which are dictionary items with a semantic meaning. And the fact that they have a semantic meaning is quite important. So that includes business elements, business associations, i.e. relationships between business elements, components, which are the things out of which business elements are made, and constraints of various kinds, which are the, as it were, the kind of inter-element rules, the things that say, if you fill in this field, then you're not allowed to fill in that field, those kinds of things. So that's the first set of things, the business concepts. Second, there are data types, and those are relatively constrained. They just specify the set of valid values of a business element or a message element. So that's all they are doing. Then there's message concepts, which include dictionary items which are used for message definition. So that includes message elements and message components and constraints. So they're similar in structure to the business concepts, except that I think a message concept will instantiate a business concept. Okay, so those are the things that are in the data dictionary, and the thing I suppose that that's worth emphasizing here is that when one thinks about a data dictionary, one tends to think about data types, but they are a relatively less important component, or at least the things called data types are a relatively less important component of what ISO 20022 thinks of as a data dictionary. So now let's look at the business model, and that provides industry agreed definitions of all financial services concepts. I'm quoting, as you can probably tell, from the ISO website. And it's used to derive the data elements used in the message definitions, so that there's a common understanding across all messages in the various business domains about what the business service, what the financial service concept means. And therefore, when data elements are used to derive a particular message, it's always clear how those are related to the underlying financial services concepts. So let me take an example. This is the business model of a payment. So you can see that on the left-hand side, there is a component called a payment. That's made up of an execution, which is made up of a payment initiation followed by a payment instruction. And for each of those payment instructions, there is a settlement instruction, which may be a cash account or a reservation. Now, the elements of a payment in the dictionary include those sorts of things. But the definition of the business model is the payment information and processes required to transfer cash end to end from the debtor to the creditor. So you can see that end to end includes settlement in the ISO world, but it doesn't include settlement in our world, at least not at the moment. Perhaps it should, but it doesn't at the moment. On the other hand, it definitely doesn't include an agreement of terms, which is important in our world. So it's immediately looking at the model from that perspective enables us to see and point to something which we definitely need to have, but which is not, it doesn't have a part in the business model as at present constituted. Now, that's not to say, of course, that as we've looked at in the past, we might say, oh, well, we could take this model and use it as if it were an agreement of terms. But that, I think, I'm coming to the view, runs counter to the way in which the ISO 20022 standards organization wants to look at the world. They want to say, if there is an activity which is called agreeing terms, which can be defined in terms of financial concepts, as we think it can, then if that's an important part of making a payment, in the same way as initiating a payment, by which they mean sending from the customer to the agent saying, please start the payment. If there is a new entity that needs to be modeled, then we should model it inside the business concept of a payment. And from that business concept, we should derive a message which can be used or should be used to define the agreement of terms. And so that is starting to show us the way forward, I think, for really making the argument for the sorts of things that we want to do. So let me look at key issues in the concept of a payment as far as we're concerned. First of all, there's the question of how you identify the parties. Moduloop, as you know, pays customers, for which it uses identifiers. And it leaves the work of mapping identifiers onto accounts to the individual DFSP. It wants to do that. That we think is a very important part of the way in which Moduloop offers a level playing field to institutions of lots of different types, all the way from international banks to village savings and loan associations, because they don't need to know anything about how that mapping is done internally. All they need to know is that the DFSP, the participant, will put its hand up to a particular kind of identifier, which might be a phone number or whatever, and say, yes, I can handle that. So that's the way in which we do things. ISO 20022 uses accounts. It just assumes that everybody will have an account. Next, there's KYC information. Now, we haven't typically, Moduloop hasn't typically done a great deal about passing KYC information. One of our founding assumptions was that, for instance, in national payment systems, it was sufficient for the participants to be compliant with the regulation in force in that jurisdiction as regards KYC for customers, and that therefore, if a customer could participate in the Moduloop system via a DFSP, that was bound to be because the DFSP had met the local requirements for KYC in relation to that customer. So there was an implicit promise from the DFSP. That's not really the case for ISO 20022 payments, because they might be going between all kinds of different institutions in different jurisdictions. And it's a situation that we will have to do something about, we Moduloop will have to do something about as we come to think about cross-network payments and remittances. So I'll be talking a bit more about those tomorrow, but I think it's clear that we have to have a good answer for how KYC information is managed and transmitted between the parties to a payment, which we don't currently need. We also need to be able to relate payment execution to other actions in the overall payment story. And when I say other actions, I mean we need to be able to relate a request for execution of a payment to the terms that were agreed for that payment. So that is the condition fulfillment pair and possibly the related quote identifier that's passed across with the payment. It also includes, for instance, I'm getting ahead of myself. It also includes request to pay. So if a payment is executed as a consequence of an original request to pay, the identifier for that request to pay will be included in our payments. And it also enables us to distinguish between retries of the same transaction and new transactions. So all of those kinds of things are important in our relating, effectively telling the story of the payment inside the information that's given, which again is something which ISO 20022 is not very concerned with. Finally, there's the question of cryptographic signature of the agreed terms, and the fact that this is very important for us both as a way for the creditor institution to be confident that it's being asked to do something that it's already agreed to, and also so that the other parties to the payment, the hub and the payer DFSP, can be confident that the payee DFSP really has made a commitment that it's cleared the funds to its customer. So those, we think, are the key issues in understanding what a payment should be for us. So when I look at ISO 20022 messages, then they use components from the data dictionary to compose the information required to perform a business task, like, for instance, a payment instruction. Now, of course, this information may be different for different types of institution, for different types of payment, and for different regulatory regimes. And a consequence of this is that ISO messages tend to expand so that they can be used in all the scenarios where a payment instruction might be required. All of the kinds of payment, all of the regulatory regimes, all of the cross-regulatory regimes, and all of the types of institution that might issue them. So what has tended to happen, and I think it's happened by design, is that these expanded items are optional in the context of the overall message. So the structure of an ISO20022 payment execution message, for instance, has a very small number of mandatory fields and a very large number of optional fields. And that's so that it can be used in many different contexts. And those contexts are constrained in individual implementations by market practice documents. Now, market practice documents are generated by individual users of ISO 20022 messages, individual schemes, for instance, SEPA, which is the European Union system for transferring payments, or SWIFT. Each of those will have a market practice document, and the market practice document is not issued by the ISO 20022 standards body. It's generated by the body that's using the messages, and basically it says, if you want to join this way of doing the messages, you're allowed to use these fields, you're not allowed to use that field. If you are using this field, then you can't use that field, and so on and so forth. So it constrains the individual use. And that in itself, of course, limits the interoperability of the messages between implementations, because if you're sending a message from an institution which does not allow a particular field to be used to an institution which requires that it should be used, then those messages will be rejected. So there's a problematic area there, but it does provide a model, potentially quite a fruitful model, for extending existing messages to support new scenarios. Finally, then, I want to look at API definitions. So our existing approach has been calqued on providing on using existing message definitions. We've assumed that those can be converted directly into Moduloop API endpoints by converting the existing XML into JSON, using, of course, sensible rules that we invented ourselves. Now, the ISO, I should say 20022 organization has been pursuing an initiative to provide a standard approach to API definition. The objective being to add value by effectively putting the business data definitions so that they can be used in API-based exchanges. They produced an initial white paper on how to do this in 2017. A draft paper was produced a year after that, explaining how to transform message level data into JSON syntax, which doesn't mean XML. There's an underlying message definition, which is, in principle at least, not XML specific. And this is a transformation of the data dictionary items. So essentially, it takes place at the same level as the transformation into XML schema definitions or into any other form of definitions. But it's about message content, which of course is not the same as an API. There is an API working group to define a governance and registration process of standardized API resources. So far, it's received one submission for consideration. We have joined the working group, both I and Jason Pollis, who is our ISO 20022 expert who's working with us on this. We've both joined that working group. And our plan is that we will submit our proposal to the API working group for consideration once it's been modeled. This is not, however, a substitute for the agreed message definitions. We see it as a parallel activity because they are both the message definitions and the API definitions are based on underlying business definitions in the data dictionary. So what's happened essentially is that the basis of the discussion has moved. It started out as a discussion about message definition centered on the existing schemas, and it's turned into a discussion about business components and data types, which we will eventually instantiate in new ways. First of all, as a set of messages in XML. Second, as a separate set of API definitions. So this discussion then will focus on two areas. First of all, is ensuring that we have the data types we need, and second, ensuring that we have the business items and the business elements that we need. So what does that mean in terms of immediate tasks? So first of all, we have agreed to review the Mojaloop data dictionary as it stands at present against the ISO data dictionary for items which can be used directly as Mojaloop data items. Amounts, for instance, might be an example. These may need to be renamed to comply with the ISO20022 definition, simply on the basis that ISO is, I think, definitely not prepared to countenance the idea that they would rename their elements to comply with ours. I don't think that eventually will be a contentious issue, but we need to be aware that it exists. Second, items which exist in the data dictionary but which require modification to meet Mojaloop's requirements. Now, exist here means semantic existence. The question we need to ask is, does ISO have an item which means the same thing as the Mojaloop item? You may recall that when I started to talk about agreement of terms a bit earlier on, I said, well, we could use an existing message to contain the information that we currently have in the agreement of terms in the quote, but it would not be right to do so because there is no ISO message whose meaning is, here are the terms to be agreed. Now, there may be a space for debate here, but if the answer is no, then we need a new item because there isn't a current item that exists. And I think that is true, will be true for the agreement of terms. Now, typically, this will mean an extension using optional elements. But as I've said before, we expect the issue of whether elements are optional or mandatory to be defined in a market practice document. Broadly speaking, we expect most of the things that we deal with to be optional in the overall schema. There are a very small number of things which are mandatory, but the market practice document will constrain them for our particular purposes. So, the final category are items which don't exist in the ISO data dictionary and must be added. So we've talked about those already, so I won't go into them in any more detail. So let me just quickly recap on what the process is going to be. First of all, the business justification is submitted and approved. And submitted and approved, and submitted and approved, sorry. The approval is followed by an evaluation phase. And in that phase, an evaluation team is formed of volunteers, which is important because people have got to be interested enough to devote their time to this. So they are either subject matter experts, i.e. people with knowledge of the business of making payments, very low value payments in high volumes in emerging economies, and also experts in the current ISO data dictionary. So when people say, I wonder if we've got anything like this, they are the people who say, well, sort of, or yes, or no. The evaluation team then provides a set of recommendations for the changes required to the ISO data dictionary to support the requirements of the business justification. Those recommendations are reviewed by the relevant standards evaluation groups, for instance, payments, but it might also include cards. And I don't think that, there might be a foreign exchange one. Anyway, and hopefully they will be approved by them. And once they've been approved, they are submitted to the registration management group for final approval and adoption. So, question is, what about subject matter experts? Now, at the last convening, you may recall we made a call for volunteers. We had some volunteers, but engagement has not been very strong so far. which is not, I mean, it's not intended as a criticism. The fact is that all these people have got other things to be getting on with. But we really need, I think, to develop a view of how payments should work in developing economies, which is wider than just the Moja Loop Foundation's view of that. I don't think it would be at all a useful thing to have a debate about what that view should be as part of the evaluation process. I would advise us strongly to try, if we possibly can, to have a worked out position on that going into the evaluation process. So I'd like to propose, in the very least, that we should arrange a workshop to review the question, how should these systems work in developing economies? Participants should include, I hope, people who've actually implemented such systems with or without ISO20022 messages, bodies who are responsible for international, regional, national standards, and the objection of the work, sorry, I'll rephrase that. The objective of the workshop needs to be to define the mandatory and the desirable characteristics required for a successful IRTP system in a developing economy. And if possible, to prioritize them, in particular, say these are the most important ones, these are the less important ones. So what are our immediate tasks? First, once the work that I've just talked about has been completed, we will include it in a new version of the business justification. The objectors, the existing objectors, chief among whom I think it's fair to say are MasterCard and the European Central Bank, have agreed to review a draft version of the business justification before we formally submit it. And this is work that we would normally have expected to happen during the evaluation phase. So in some ways, it's disappointing that we are being asked to provide it as input to the business justification approval. On the other hand, it has to be done at some point anyway. And it might very well be that failing fast would be something that we will eventually say, it's good that that happened. And we would certainly hope that this will greatly accelerate the acceptance of the recommendations after the evaluation phase, because most of the things that we would have expected to have happened in the evaluation phase will already have happened. So that's all I have to say on that. Let me throw the thing open to questions. Sorry, I'm just looking at Johann's question. Ding, ding, ding. Ah, yes. So Johann, you have the quote ID question. So there is clearly something wrong with the ISO data type. Because it doesn't allow, there is no ISO 20022 identifier, which is 36 characters long, which is what we need for UUIDs of all kinds. Now, I've raised this question a number of times in the business justification and the discussions about it. And generally speaking, people's view is that they are not against the idea that there should be a new form of identifier, either as an alternative to the existing form of identifier, or perhaps as a separate type of identifier, which should be included and which people will be able to use if they want to. The other point that I want to add in relation to identifiers is that we have a lot more of them than the ISO messages do. And that's because, as I said already, of the way in which we want to give the history of the message, to be able to say, this is the quote on which this transfer execution request relies. This is the original request to pay on which this quote ID relies and on which this transfer execution ID relies, those sorts of things. Typically, those things don't exist in the ISO 20022 messages at the kind. However, I feel your pain, Johan, and I certainly agree with it. Does anyone else have any questions that they would like to ask? in the 1 minute I see that remains to us.
There is time. We've got about 10 minutes in this session. So,
Oh, right.
Right. So if anyone has any questions, it would be appropriate to even allow them to.
Sorry, I was thinking that I was just on time.
You are. You did very well. Cool.
Thank you. Am I allowed to vote on rating my presentation? Is my next question, Simeon.
No, not as a speaker.
No.
But yes, I would thank everybody for participating in the rating. Just watching the chat to see if there's any questions. Right.
Oh, great. Thanks very much, Michael. I'll be calling you and hoping for Africananda to put in an excellent showing of the workshop. But I think I probably want to also wind in Steve and Paul Makin to look at how we would sort out getting a workshop of that kind set up. Thank you, Paul.
Awesome. So we've got about 10 minutes left in this session. I will, Michael, if unless you've got any last comments.
No, I don't think so.
Okay. Well, I guess then we'll take another quick 10-minute break, and then in 10 minutes time, that should be at 1:50 p.m. UTC. I'll have Pedro come up with the vNext development updates. So let's take a quick 9-minute break now, and then at the top of the hour we'll have Pedro. Thank you, everybody.